And we've all wanted to know who our ancestors are. Some of us know when they came to this country. Some of us may want to delve further than that into history. And of course, we now have all these tools, 23andMe and whatever else we can get. And you take tests and it tells you this is who your great grandfather was. I'm lucky. I didn't need all this stuff because it was done for me in the 1920s by a relative of mine, now deceased, who put together a family tree of the Rivlin family. That's my mother's family. It's a name you may know, only because some of you may know that my first cousin, Reuven Rivlin, was the immediate past president of Israel. But he is only one Rivlin in a long line of Rivlins who have made significant contributions to the settling of the Holy Land, the creation of the state, and now the life of the state in the last 75 years. And I've been blessed by being taught this history from my family members for my entire life, since I was a little boy. And so what I'm going to tell you today is, for the most part, stories that have been told to me over the years by any number of people, many of whom now are blessed memory, but which I've really wanted to delve into and sort of and myself verify to see whether they are accurate. And I've been lucky enough over the last 20 or 25 years to come up with, scouring libraries and bookstores around the country and in Israel to come up with some books that have actually validated many of the stories they've told me. Not 100%. And some of it may be family embellishment, but you'll stick with me if you can. And so when Eliezer Rivlin did this family tree, he was able to trace our roots back to 16th century Prague. Wow. Now, and we believe that those members had come from Vienna after being expelled from Spain. There is some, there's some people think that most of the people expelled from Spain are Sephardic, and many are and went to Amsterdam, North Africa, etc. But there are a number of people expelled who went to modern day France, Germany, Vienna, but my family wound up in Prague. And the first person he was able to identify was Joseph Chavar, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He was a rabbi in Prague who died in 1559. And if any of you who have ever been to Prague, and we have the quote new cemetery there, the new synagogue there with the cemetery, his gravestone is in that cemetery. And the reason they were able to put this family tree together, I believe, it's not like I was there and I know, is that almost every man in this tree, going back over something close to over 400 years, was a rabbi. And almost every woman was the daughter or mother of a rabbi. So if you have written records from rabbinical life over centuries, I would think it's a lot easier to put together than if someone in your family, to demean this in any way, was an artisan or was not involved in rabbinical life. And so for the next 3 generations in Prague, the family were soferim, they were scribes. They scribed Torah, but one of them and the final one was actually the chief scribe for the Prague community. His name was Naftali Hirsch Sofer. It's in an hour I wouldn't be able to go through everyone in the family, but a few generations down, you get to a very significant rabbi who lived. By then, the family had moved to. Let's shut this off. The family had by then the family had moved to Vilna, and a rabbi in the 17th century named Moshe Rivkes was a leader of the Vilna Jewish community at a time when there were pogroms, and he was forced from Vilna and had to go and spend about 10 years in Amsterdam, where he learned about the Amsterdam Jewish community and wrote extensively about it He also wrote a commentary, which is still studied today on itself, the commentary known as Shulchan Aruch. And he was a very well-regarded rabbi, and his name Rivkis, we believe, is where the family name Rivlin may have come from. His granddaughter married a rabbi from a family in Vilna who themselves, two of those rabbis, had been the Av Beit Din of the rabbinical court. It was the chief justice of the rabbinical court in Vilna for all congregations in Poland and Lithuania. And so the family remained in Vilna for quite a while, and then became followers of the Gaon of Vilna. Now, this was in Lithuania. I'll show you. Here is the Gaon. You may have heard of him. He was Vilna's, Lithuania's leading rabbi at the end of the 18th century. I am not a descendant of the Gaon, although we have a common ancestor in his great-grandfather, and he was the leader of the movement known as the Mitnavim, the disbelievers, because they were thwarting the increased presence and hegemony of the Chabad Hasidim, which had themselves developed, as you may know, around what is now modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and in parts of Lithuania. There was a real rivalry between them. The Chabad believed, that I'm not a rabbinical scholar, but if you know that our redemption joy comes from dance, from the joy of Torah, from singing, from being one in the community. The Mitnavim were traditional Talmudists. They believed that our way of life should be the study of Talmud, the study at yeshivot, and that is what the Gaon was in favor of. The Gaon believed that the Mashiach was coming soon, and believed that it was imperative to settle in the Holy Land. Of course, it was not called the land of Israel yet, in the Holy Land. So when the Messiah comes, there will be Jews in Jerusalem to greet the Messiah. And so at that time, and I'll show you here. So this is maybe not the greatest map in the world, but this is a Lithuanian map of Lithuania. And one thing it shows, this line shows you how the borders of Lithuania change. The Talmudists were for the most part here in Vilnius, but the Gaon encouraged his followers to come and settle in this part of what is now modern-day Belarus near Minsk, in a town called Shklov. And that is where my ancestors settled. And so in the late 18th century, a very prominent rabbi named Shlomo Zalman Rivlis, who was the first to take a name that was like Rivlin, was at Shklov, and boy, did he have a surprise in store for himself. He had several children. Two of them were prominent. One of them's name was Benjamin Rivlin, who was a follower of the Gaon, very strict follower of the Gaon, and another son, Eliyahu, who became known as Plakis, who was Chabad, a follower of Shner Zalman of Lev. And so you can imagine the kind of tension this may have created in the family. But at that time, so the family was living for the most part in and around Vilna, and my direct ancestors lived in Shklov. The Gaon died in 1797. And my direct ancestor, Benjamin Rivlin, was a very close student of the Gaon, I think, very close student of the Gaon, and created what was called Chazon Zion, the Vision of Zion Society, and encouraged Jews in the Vilna Shklov community to emigrate to Israel. And he had a son, the one who followed the Gaon, named Hillel Rivlin, who was a very successful, I understand that I think he was like a chemist in Shklov, but he had money. And he was able to raise enough money to have 70 families in 1809. This is, what do I need to get this to?
Double click on the screen.
Just double click on the screen?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay, so in 1809, Hillel Rivlin led 70 families from Vilna, this part of Lithuania, through the landmass of what is sort of Eurasia, down into Turkey, where they got stuck and eventually wound up in 1809 in the port of, I thought it'd be Jaffa. They were in Haifa. They were actually in Haifa. This trip took 300 days. And who knows what kind of bribing it entailed. What they didn't have great intelligence. I mean, they just knew there was a Holy Land, and they went, but they really didn't know exactly what they would find. Well, what they found when they got to Jerusalem, about 2,000 Jews, all of whom were Sephardic. There was an attempt about 100 years earlier for a community of Ashkenazic to settle in Jerusalem, and they didn't do well. They incurred a lot of debts to Arab landlords, and the Sephardim and the Arabs, for the most part, quote, got along. And from what I understand, if the Turks, the Ottomans, were not the worst of all of the imperial rulers. They didn't mistreat the Jews the way, it may have been a different kind of environment. I mean, in Europe, I suppose Jews were seen as Christ killers, etc. I don't know if you had this in the Ottoman world. So the Sephardim and the Ottomans were getting along okay, but they wanted no part of the Ashkenazi in Jerusalem. So a number of the people who came on that trip had to go to Tzfat. They went to Tzfat for about a year or two, but there was a cholera epidemic, and they eventually came back and then settled in Jerusalem permanently from 1810. They established the Gaon's presence in Jerusalem, and they became known as what we call the Prushim. The Prushim. They were the Lithuanian Jews. If you ever seen Steisel, the Israeli TV show, it's called Steisel, they are the descendants of the Prushim. Not to get too deeply into it, there is some thought, there's some movement, I should say, some group of people who believe that this was the initial religious Zionist movement, which came before the secular Zionist movement, and this is really what the Gaon wanted to see Israel created. I'm not sure that that's right. There's been some pushback on that theory. I think the Gaon just wanted a presence in Jerusalem for when the Messiah came, but things were not good in Jerusalem. The conditions were bad. The Ashkenazic, the Prushim, still had to get over this problem with the Sephardim and with the Arab landlords and with the Ottomans, and the community was just gradually getting weaker and weaker. But Hillel Rivlin stayed in Jerusalem as he was getting older, and what they tried to create the great synagogue in Jerusalem. They couldn't buy the land to do that, right? But they were able to assemble enough land to build in Jerusalem the Cherva synagogue. Now, this was the main Lithuanian synagogue that existed in Jerusalem from about the 1840s until 1948, when it was destroyed during the War of Independence. It has since been rebuilt. If you've been to Jerusalem, it was rebuilt about 15 or 20 years ago, not exactly in the same style, but it has since been rebuilt. And members of the community went back to Shklov to bring the Torot to the Cherva synagogue, which housed the Torot, for many generations. Hillel died. He had a son named Moshe, who had stayed back in Shklov and Lithuania and traveled around Europe raising money for this initiative in Jerusalem. He was known as Hamagid, the speaker. He was very well known, thought of as being a wonderful speaker, a wonderful community organizer. When his father died, the Prushim asked him to come to Jerusalem to lead the Jerusalem Lithuanian and Ashkenazi community, which he did. And under his leadership, he died about 6 years after he came, but under his leadership, the Jewish community began to thrive. It started to create a kind of infrastructure. I mean, it's not as if the Ottomans were going to create hospitals and places of study, etc. And this is now what the Lithuanians did, what the Prussian did. They started to create the infrastructure to support life in Jerusalem. And here is a picture of the interior of the Cherva before it was destroyed in 1948. I don't know what year this picture was taken.
Can you repeat the picture before? Can you go back?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That is in the Jewish section of the Old City. That's what it was. Moshe's grandson. Say hello to Yosef Rivlin. He is not a direct ancestor of mine, but I'll tell you in an interesting way how he became involved in my family. He was Moshe Rivlin's grandson and became the head of what was called the secretary of the general committee of the Prushim in Jerusalem, and was really a community leader. He and 6 other families pulled their money to create the first community, first neighborhood outside the old city walls. He believed that if the Messiah was to come, that Jews had to spread out beyond the old city walls. And in 1869, right, he built the first house. This group of 7 built the first house in a community called Nahalat Sheva, the community of 7. And there it is on the right. His house is the one on the behind the head of this man in front. And so the family story always went. I've seen this backed up by some commentary, firsthand accounts in this book, that it was very dangerous out there. It was several hundred yards from the old city walls, but it was dangerous out there. And in fact, the walls, the gates to the city were shut and locked every night, keep marauders from coming in. He went and spent the first several nights with a Sephardic watchman, bodyguard, I guess. And literally the Jewish community would go to the Jaffa gate every morning when the gate doors opened to make sure that Reb Yosa was there. And he would come, and eventually Nachalat Sheva was settled by the other families. Reb Yosa was the founder or co-founder of 13 communities in Jerusalem, including Mea Sharim. And I've been blessed to have this book, and I'm sorry that for people on the I literally have the bylaws and the sort of the offering statements that were sent with the plans for all of this with his name on it. He became known, Reb Yosa, as Reb Yosa de Shtettelmacher. I guess if you do make 13. So he had a number of children, right? His wife died. Now, remember I told you what happened, it wasn't unfortunately, the Shlomo Zalman Rivlin. He had 2 sons, one Benjamin, who was a Miknadev, and then his son Eliyahu, who became a Chabad. Well, Eliyahu's grandson moved to Hebron in the 1840s. The Chabad had actually beaten the Miknadvim to the Holy Land by a few years and had settled at Hebron because that's where the tombs of the patriarchs are, and you know that from current events in Israel. And so he moved to Hebron and had children, including my great grandfather. So my great grandfather, who came from the Chabad tradition, met and married my great grandmother, who was Moshe Rivlin's granddaughter, Moshe Hamagiv's granddaughter. And that was a great intermarriage of the Chabad and the Miknadev communities. And they got married, had my grandfather, right? My great grandfather died in 1885. My great grandmother then married Reb Yosef. So she married her cousin, right? And now here's where it really gets weird, right? One of each of their children married each other. Stepchildren married each other, right? And stepchildren married each other. And by the way, I should mention that today, Nachalat Sheva, which is Yosef Rivlin Street, it doesn't do justice to it. It is now the hippest street in Jerusalem. It's near the bottom of Jaffa Road. And if you go down to it, it's nothing but hookah bars and bars and restaurants right now. But Rivlin Street is where the action is in Jerusalem. And those buildings still stand. The municipality preserved them in the 1950s, and they still stand today. The man on the left in the hat, it's sort of the brimmed hat, is Yosef's son. And that is Zalman Rivlin, and he was the head of a choir in Jerusalem called Shalit Yisrael, which educated literally hundreds of cantors. The cantor who gave me my bar mitzvah lessons in Far Rockaway, New York, and Irving Davis studied under Shlomo Rivlin at Shalit Yisrael. I must have been in the 1920s, I would think. But there he is, and it was a very well known and very well thought of school for training cantors. This is my first cousin, Reuven Rivlin, the immediate past president of Israel. He is through his father. Now this gets a little confusing. Through his father is a direct descendant of Hillel Rivlin, who first came. And he is a bona fide sixth generation Jerusalemite. He is a sixth generation Jerusalemite. I'm very, again, blessed. I mean, I have so many things that I can share that I've been given, but this is my immediate family. This is the roots of these are the children of my grandparents. Now, my grandparents had, my grandmother Alta was the daughter of a rabbi. My grandfather, ordained rabbi. I don't know that he did anything prominent in his life, but he did have 12 wonderful children. My mother is the youngest of those 12 children. And so Zev Benjamin, who's married to one of my mother's sisters and is himself a cousin, put this book together when the family had a reunion in 1980. And there you see me. My mother is the youngest of the 12. There's a typo here. She was the youngest to be born, and she was known as Boo-Boo, not because she was a, quote, mistake, even though she followed her next oldest sister by 6 years, but her name in Hebrew was Buba, the doll. And so they called her Buba, Boo-Boo, which came Anglicanized to Boo-Boo. And then you see my family name, Freddie, there I am. But you can see how many of my cousins, my first cousins, were born in Jerusalem or still live in Israel, etc. And this is my grandparents with my great grandmother in Cardiff, Wales, before they came to the United States. My grandparents were both born in Jerusalem in the 1870s. They moved to the UK in 1898 and a number of Hebron Rivlins had moved to Cardiff, and they joined the family there. My great-grandmother, Yosef Rivlin, had died by then. They actually had a son together, Yosef, and that's my great-grandmother holding one of my aunts, and we knew her affectionately as Baba Minna. Now, Baba Minna was born in 1850. She died in 1953. Her earliest memory, this comes from a cousin of mine, still alive, probably in his early 90s, was as a 5-year-old girl going to a parade for the King of Belgium, who had come to the Holy Land. And she remembers waving Belgian flags when the king came to visit. I looked that up and went back. That was done in 1855. So the memories going back. These are this is my mother and her 6 sisters. There were 7 sisters and 5 brothers. This is the first time they had been together in 55 years. In the same, not only in the same room, but in the same country. That's my mother is the one on the bottom. The woman just behind her with her hand on her chin, that's Rachel Rivlin, and she was the president's mother. And so there's a sort of an interesting story here. All of these women were born either in the UK or the United States. In 1926, my grandfather asked this aunt, Rachel, to go to Jerusalem to look out after my great-grandmother. Rachel got married. She had 2 children. Her husband died. And she remarried a cousin, Professor Yosef Yoel Rivlin. I'll talk to you about it in a second. So she stayed in Jerusalem, and then this sister went to visit her, and lo and behold, she met a guy, a Sephardi Jew who was in the import-export business in Haifa, who himself had been born in Bulgaria, and she stayed. And according to my mother, my grandmother said, at that point, she said, I've had it. I haven't been in Jerusalem since 1898. It was 1932. And she took my mother and this aunt, her next old, as soon as this woman, Hilda, graduated from high school in Brooklyn, she took them to live in Jerusalem, which is where my mother lived from 1932 to 1945. Hilda married an Israeli, Lil married an Israeli, and Rachel married an Israeli. So these 3 were Israeli and had very large families. She had all of 1 child, and she must have something like 17 grandchildren and many, many more great-grandchildren. These others, so my mother's maiden name was Rivlin. Her marriage, she was educated in England. When she finished high school in New York, she went back to England. She married a Rivlin. So my mother has 2 sisters whose maiden and married names were Rivlin. And lo and behold, my name's Fred Strober. This woman is Betty Strober. Her husband was my father's brother. So my mother's, of the 7 women, 4 of them were either married to Strobers or Rivlins. So you can imagine how close our families were. This was done in 1980 when we had a family reunion. I couldn't go. I was a summer clerk at my law firm, and I just couldn't give up the opportunity. In 2009, we had a reunion in Israel that was attended by 3,500 family members. Now, word has it, I don't know, that the Rivlins are the largest Ashkenazi family in Israel. I have reason to believe that may be true. Among people, it's a lot of Americans in this picture, a lot of, there are any number of Israelis in this picture. This is Rachel's son from my oldest living cousin, I guess, Avi Rivlin. I don't know if any of you know or heard of Lil Rivlin, the feminist writer and filmmaker. She was born in Jerusalem. She now lives in New York. So this is our family. It's hard to see, unfortunately. The youngest in the family is up here, 13 years younger than I am, but I do come from, my mother was and father was the youngest in their families. This man who is now passed was a cousin of mine in Chicago. His father, my mother's oldest brother, was a rabbi in the United States.
Great. And I'm supposed to wait till the end, but could you just say why that branch moved out of Israel?
You mean in 1898? I think because my grandfather was looking to make. I mean, if you asked my mother and her sisters, what did grandpa do? They would sort of roll over, oh, he was insurance. He sold lulav and esrog, the base of the Brooklyn Group. He was investing in a uranium mine in Chicago. He, whatever it was. In Israel, my aunts would visit Israel all the time. So when I was in Israel in 1973, one of my American aunts who I was very close to here in the States, I grew up with her. We were in Israel together. And she finally said to me, she said, when I graduated high school, Grandpa got me a job. And it took me about 2 weeks to realize I was working for gangsters. So, as I said, I don't know what my grandfather did other than having 12 wonderful children, several of whom were like grandparents to me. And I do have in this here, I have, Elaine, I have all of his immigration papers, right, for the United States. I'll tell you one little interesting story about that. If you look at his declaration for when he was naturalized, you have to disavow your allegiance to the sovereign of the country you're coming from. And so if you look at immigration papers of so many of your grandparents or great grandparents, I disavow allegiance of any and all allegiance to Tsar Nicholas II, right? So my grandfather did. My grandfather never lived in Russia, right? So I have a cousin who's in London, a lawyer in London. He said, I know one. He came to the United States. They said to him, Joe, everyone comes from Russia. You put down Jerusalem. They won't know what to do with you. They'll send you back. They're not going to ask you for your birth certificate. Just put down Russia. So if you look at my grandfather's immigration certifications, he says he's from Russia and he says that he disavows allegiance. So just so this it's a shame that we have some faces that are sort of need to get this up. And I can really get this. Let's see. How do I get that one back now? Oops. How do I get this? Thank you. We did it. We do it on time. Okay, I have about 10 minutes. I can just see if we can scroll through. Good. Back to the beginning. I can just go through this. Okay. So this is the iconic picture. Oh, this, we got to get that. We've got to get that thing done because because most important faces aren't in there. Let's see if we can. Let's see if we can just. Good. Okay. This is the iconic. Good. Thank you. This is the iconic picture for my family. People say that's Baba Minna in the black shawl over her head, my great grandmother, born in 1850. People say this was her 100th birthday. It can't be. I believe it's either her 90th or maybe her 92nd, because my mother was not there for my great grandmother in Israel during my great grandmother's 100th birthday. So this is my great grandmother, born in 1850 and married for her second marriage to Yosef Reuven. And she was the one who came from the traditional family who married the Chabad, right? This is my grandmother, who's the daughter of a Russian-born rabbi named Zissenswine, Alta. This is my mother, 20 years old, 21 years old, who was working at that point for Barclays Bank. This picture, I believe, was taken in 1942. And one of the things that my mother told me was how much fear the Jerusalem residents had of Rommel coming across North Africa and invading Palestine. This is the cantor who I showed you. This man was one of the most influential people in my life. This is Professor Yosef Yoel Rivlin, my Aunt Rachel's second husband and the father of the future president. Here's the future president right here. Here's his babysitter. My mother was his babysitter. He was a Zionist, a follower of Jabotinsky. So he was a recruit, he was a fervent follower of Jabotinsky, a professor of Arabic studies at Hebrew University, a very close friend of Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who also taught at Hebrew University. During the First World War, the Turks exiled him to Damascus, where he ran a girls' yeshiva for several years, even after the war. He then went to Frankfurt to get his PhD and became an Islamic scholar, and married my aunt after his first wife died in about, must have been about 1928 or 29. He translated the Quran into Hebrew. He translated 1001 Nights, Elef Laila V'Laila, tell me. He came to this country when I was a 7-year-old boy when I first met him, and I was in awe of him. Everyone talked about Professor Rivlin. He had actually been nominated to be president of Israel in 1952. And I remember as a young kid, he was improving his English and reading dime novels. He was at my aunt's house and he looked up and he said, "What's a cop?" COP. And I said, "It's a policeman." And I was so proud of myself that I showed Professor Rivlin at that time. In fact, he had just come back, he had a picture of himself a vice president, new vice president, like this was 50, Richard Nixon. This must have been 1957 or something. So if I was 56 in any event, when I was a junior and senior in high school, he came to NYU to teach biblical studies to graduate students, and lived on Fifth Avenue and 10th Street. And for the 2 years he was here, we would see him often. I would go into New York and have Shabbat lunch with him. My aunt would make lunch. And over maybe 5 or 6 sessions, he taught me almost all I know about the family and about Zionism, Jabotinsky, and what it was like to be it was just a remarkable experience for me. He died in 1971, and his pallbearers included Menachem Begin. He was known, in the years later when the sons of these professors in Netanyahu, my cousin, they were known as the princes of the Likud. Someone said, "Where were the great professors of the right? What has ever happened to them?" This is what he was known of. When he was a son of Jerusalem, and shortly after the 6-Day War, about a month after the 6-Day War, he was asked by Israeli TV to give a walking tour of the old city. And so I was on a kibbutz in 1974, and my Aunt Rachel had turned 70. I was going to her birthday party. And so I got assigned that day to work in the kitchen, and the women were all throwing pots and pans at me to wash and all. They said, how come you're here today? So I'm going to who's your Aunt Rachel? And I said, Rachel Rivlin. And she said, "You mean the wife of you tell me if I'm right, Hazakan? What's the word for a wise man? Hazakan? Hazakan? Zakan, yeah. No, there's a wise man. And so I said, yes. And then within a half hour, I had a cake to bring to my aunt for her birthday. This is somehow whether this is. Oh, okay. I will. I was very blessed in 2014. I had a chance to visit my cousin and introduce him to the leadership of American Jewish Committee. And I thanked him for that. He sent me this letter back, and I just want to read something. I must say that our meeting allowed that the words to the AJC members were not just lip service. I truly believe that the familiar relationship that we share as cousins is the type of relationship that exists between that many branches of the Jewish people. And of course, here's something that I have bragging rights for. He says, I'm happy to spend a special time with you as your parents were my favorite aunt and uncle. So I thought that was wonderful. And then in 2009, we had a family reunion that President Perez was the guest speaker at. He introduced the family, and my daughter Rebecca, who had just made Aliyah, was asked to represent diaspora children who were making Aliyah to Israel, to represent the family. And there she is in front of 3,500 people giving a talk. And I know the Smiths saw her speak just 2 weeks ago here in Philadelphia. That's Rebecca, who you saw talk. And so I will just read to you one thing that has stuck with me, and then if we have some time for pictures, take some. And so this is, the sort of the family I grew up with. And for our 1980 reunion, we had one of my distant cousins was asked whether we Rivlins regard ourselves as as Yaksani aristocrats. So I'll just read what his answer was. If aristocrat signifies property and wealth, you can rest assured that the word doesn't apply to us. If it is a token of position and privilege, we don't at all expect that. If the word implies that we live in the shadow of great forebears, that we never want. But if Yaksani indicates being conscious of a family's roots in its spiritual patrimony, treasuring the gifts of ancestors to the renaissance of our people, and most important, continuing the struggle for our people's spiritual and physical life, then we may be willing to call ourselves Yaksani. And so I'm very proud that my daughter Rebecca is following this family tradition of being in Israel. It's been, as my mother said about my grandfather, he hopsigged everywhere, went from here to here. The family is really hopsigged from Lithuania to Jerusalem to Cardiff to Brooklyn, now with my daughter to Israel. And it's been for me just a wonderful privilege to be a member of the family, but especially to learn from so many of them over the year what our roots are and what our contributions are. So if there's anything to take away from the class, I think the two most significant things that the family has contributed, or the immigration, the Great Migration in 1809 to establish the Lithuanian community, and then Joseph Rivlin's willingness to build and live outside the old city walls, to be the first Jew actually to live outside the old city. There are many family members today who are prominent. I mean, I don't say that to brag. I'm very proud of them. Just recently stepped down. Eliezer Rivlin was a justice of the Supreme Court. And I even have a cousin, Jeremy Kaplan. If you were really hip and you know rock in Israel, you would know all the 16-year-old young ladies that Jeremy Kaplan on their lips at all times. So the family has made great contributions, of which I'm very proud. And I'm very happy to be here with you today to share that with you. So, thank you. And we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has.
Just a comment, as amazing as that was, and I learned a whole lot more than I know about you, but I think even more amazing is that your mother and my mother were friends in Delray Beach, and they're buried about 10 yards apart.
That's right. Yeah,
So that's really,
the connections are the connections never end. And of course, last week we had at AJC, the consul from Israel came, and I said to him, I know there are pictures on the wall in the consulate of all the former consuls, and I had a cousin there, David Rivlin, who was consul in the 1960s. He said, "Are you Rivlin?" I said, "Well, my mother's Rivlin." He said, "I'm Rivlin." But I asked him how. He said, "Well, my mother's mother, who's a Babel, and that." So, and I'm very happy I can trace it.
are all the Rivlins related? Do you think
they are related? I mean, we believe that we all have common roots. And if you went to England, it'd be France, it'd be Lean. There are some. There are a fairly nice York, England. Cardiff still, London, a little bit Buenos Aires, not much, and but a lot in Israel, and here in the United States.
Fred, did you say that one of your ancestors wrote the Shulchan?
No, he wrote a commentary. He wrote a commentary, and I forget what the name of the commentary is. I should have written it down, but I have it here in these materials. He wrote a commentary to the Shulchan Aruch. No, I think the Shulchan Aruch was written, I think, about 100 years or so before. So he wrote a commentary that was very well thought of and still taught today. When I was in Israel with AJC, the AJC Council, General Counsel named Mark Stern had gone to Yeshiva and Yeshiva University. And when we passed by, I mentioned to him, that's where my family, the Rivens, lived. He said it was Moshe. He said, and you're a descendant of Moshe Rivkas. I said, yes. He said, because we learned about him in Yeshiva as the commentator for the Shulchan.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah. And then what he did, Ellen, he went to Amsterdam where he wrote journals and kept records of meetings of the Amsterdam Jewish community, which he assembled, which when I went to Jerusalem in 1973, I was, my uncle died 2 years earlier. Those books were in his safe. So, and they have since been taken. I forget exactly who it was, but that was in some archive somewhere. So he was. He left. My aunt would give as bar mitzvah presents. She was entitled to as many as she wanted. My uncle translated 1001 Nights into Hebrew. Elef, Lila, Valilas, what came in like 30 little booklet volumes, these things. And so she would go pick them up and she would give those as bar mitzvah presents. And she was a wonderful. She herself was a city council person.
Wow.
And when I was in Jerusalem, and I went to Jerusalem in 1973 to visit her and to meet one aunt who was the one who married a Sephardic guy in Haifa. I'd never met her before. And while I was there, the Yom Kippur War broke out. And so I stayed in Israel. I went to a kibbutz in the north. I stayed in Israel until early July 1974. So I was there for the better part of 10 months. Whatever Hebrew I learned, I forgot.
I connect to so much of your story. Nachalat Shiva is where I lived on a rooftop as a student
Really?
in Jerusalem.
Really?
When it was run down.
Run down. It was.
Oh gosh, and only cold hot water for like 2 hours a day.
Yeah,
I mean,
it was really run down.
Very cheap. So I
Yeah,
can afford it.
that's interesting. So Nachalat
Oh, I do, not the way it's now. I haven't seen the renovation.
Yeah.
But also, your family is very well known in Israel and obviously made tremendous contributions. I'm just wondering how you feel about your family coming initially as supporters of Jabotinsky, who was really a nationalist.
Yeah, he's it's not my political sentiment. I've come to respect it. The one thing I've learned about Jabotinsky and his followers is that as right-wing as they are and as greater Israel they believe of equality between Jews and non-Jews. And at least Jabotinsky always believed that the Arabs should be treated equally. Although I suppose you would think that taken to modern days, that would be a one-state Israel with But so I myself don't believe in Jabotinsky's teaching. The man who wrote this book, Zev Benjamin, was a disciple of Jabotinsky, and he once said to me, "You have to be there to know how good a speaker he was. He was the most influential. He could stir emotions and really get people to act. And Ben Zion Netanyahu was his secretary, was Jabotinsky's secretary.
Oh.
Yeah, he actually worked with Jabotinsky. And so I have mixed feelings. The family, by the way, is all over the map, anywhere from Meretz to the Old Heirut. And there are some people who are of that Lithuanian Haredim. Still to this day, their name is Porush, P-O-R-U-S-H in English, Porush. And there is, up until recently, there was a minister in the Knesset who was from the religious party, the Ashkenazic religious party, who was a minister, his name was Flores. So there are still some family members. I don't know of any equivalents, but if I don't know if you remember in Steitzel one day, the teacher got sick and she said, oh, I can always call a substitute. I'll call Professor Riffle or Rabbi Riffle. So it's like, I heard it. I don't know who else did. So there are still some, I suppose.
But obviously your daughter doesn't represent the right.
No, my daughter does not represent the right, just the contrary. I've had people of, even a generation or so below me have made wonderful contributions. I had one cousin, Hanan Eshkol, who died young. He died maybe in his early 50s, but he was a very prominent Dead Sea Scroll scholar at Bar Ilan University. His wife's the same. So it's really, we have 4 family members who died in the War of Independence. And we have any number of family members who served in the military. There are family members who founded Ramat Gan, family members who founded Kibbutz Gesher. I'm just mentioning some of the places you may have heard of. So as you know, there was once an expression my mother said to me when I was a little boy. She said, in Israel, if you throw a rock out the window, you're going to hit a dog or a rook. So, I rest my case.
We have time for one last question, if anyone has another question.
I'll ask a little offbeat one. Were any of your American relatives involved in the World War II effort, a little bit successful, but largely unsuccessful, to wake up the states to the Holocaust, which would involve the Polsky family here?
I wouldn't, Steve, if there were, I don't know. I mean, there are some, there was, I don't know if I can go back. It's hard to go back. If you, in that picture of Baba Minna, there's one man and behind her smiling next to his wife. That man, born in America, within about 2 or 3 months of that, got his draft notice. My mother had 2 brothers living in 1939. 9 of the siblings lived in Jerusalem in 1939, not for various reasons. The oldest brother, who was a rabbi, actually went to work for an insurance company. He was named as Sun Life of Canada's representative for the Middle East. And so back in the day, he actually traveled to Damascus and Alexandria. But those 2 brothers, after Rommel was defeated, joined the American Army in North Africa. The British took them from Jerusalem to the American Army base. They trained there. They were discharged in the United States. They called for their wives and children to come, and my mother accompanied them on the boat from Alexandria in December 1945 to New York. She stayed with her sister. I was married to my father's brother. My father had just come back from the war, and so, my mother got married and didn't go back until 1968, actually.
Laura has a question online. She asked, is there another book that Fred referred to besides the family history written by Z. Benjamin?
By Zev Benjamin? No, not that I would know of by Zev Benjamin. He was not an author. He was a greengrocer. He was a wholesale greengrocer. I point to Tom because of Tom Perloff's family. So that's what he did for a living. There are any number of books, though, that Professor Yosef Yoel Rivlin wrote. And also there are many books written by Eliezer Rivlin and other Rivlins about history, about the times of the settlement of the Lithuanians, etc.
I cannot thank Fred enough for this exquisite presentation. I'm sure we all learned so much about Israel for the founding of the state. And it's just such a response to people who say that there weren't Jews in Israel before the founding of the state of Israel. So for so many reasons, it was so rich, Fred. And the way you combine your personal story with the history of Israel, it was just the most remarkable experience. I actually had tears in my eyes listening to you. I thought it was so remarkable. So let's just So, there will be evaluation sheets at the end of the week that I think are coming electronically, right, Stephen? And so for all the classes that you attend, there'll be an opportunity to tell us, how you felt about each class. And our class this afternoon has been canceled. There is no afternoon class today, but tomorrow there's the real story of Hanukkah at 11. God's Cupboard, which is the class about the Torah Ark with Rabbi Mader as the moderator and Michael Hauptman as the presenter. That's at 2. And of course, Rabbi Friedman is teaching the real story of Hanukkah class at 11. And then at 3:45 is Rabbi Mader and a panel, including Mon Kramer, talking about the trip to Morocco. And that's going to be with the PowerPoint and photos and things that they brought back. So that should be a remarkable class also. So thank you for coming. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. And thanks to Fred for this incredible program.
Yes.
Organization.
Yes, for bringing this. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are you from Jerusalem?
I'm from Haifa originally, but I studied in
My
Jerusalem.
family in Haifa is Mishulam, is their name. Mishulam. They live, that's sort of a.
Mount Carmel?
Yeah,
I live on
Carmel.
Mount Carmel.
And Hanadiv Street. Hanadiv.
And I didn't, not far from there.
Goodbye, cyber world.
So.
So which quarter of